And thank you so much for talking with us. In your recent book, Storied Companions, you talk about your experiences over the years living with an incurable form of brain cancer. And you describe how you learn from your experiences, but you're also learning from Buddhist stories, and particularly how you make Buddhist stories your companions on this often lonely path that you've been experiencing. Can you tell us how and why Buddhist stories became your friends and resources?
Yes, I have found that in my culture that people don't want to talk about death. They don't want to recognize their own movement towards death. And so when I was going through treatment particularly, even though I was very devastated by the treatment, when people saw me, they didn't want to see it. So they would say things like, "Oh, you look so great." And they'd say, maybe they'd say, "Oh, how are you? You look so great," which was like, okay, they know that I have this really monstrous form of brain cancer, so they'd acknowledge that, but then, oh, it really isn't having any effect on her. Like, look how good she looks. And so I would, sometimes I would just react by saying, "How am I? Not so great. I have brain cancer." And sometimes that would just be much too severe for people, and I'd cause someone, or that statement would cause people to start crying, or like leave the room, or not talk to me again for many months. Many of my friends, I know they love me, but they can't talk about my cancer with me. They don't talk to me about the reality that I am going to die sooner than I want to, and sooner than they want me to. It's a very hard reality for people to accept, and the idea that they'll have me absent from their life is something that very few people can talk with me about. And I've started to learn that and accept that, but it does make me, the intensity of loneliness that I've experienced as a sick person, it makes it much worse, because no one can accept, no one could understand what it feels like to live for this long with the pains of not necessarily the disease, but the ongoing pain of the effects of the treatment that I've had. Every day I wake up feeling not well, and every day I go to bed feeling not well. And now that the long-term effects, especially of the full brain radiation, are making it impossible for me to walk well or to keep my balance well, it's become much, much more visible and hard for people to ignore. And I honestly don't know what that's going to mean for people, if they'll avoid me altogether or find a way to deal with it. And the Buddhist story that really helped me see that there were resources. There was especially how Buddhism, how the Dharma helps me feel less lonely, comes from, the very well-known narrative of what's called the 4 signs or the 4 omens, when Prince Siddhartha, the Buddha in his final lifetime, he's born into a royal family, and as the story is usually told, at his birth, there were many miracles that happened, and his father is told that there's two possible avenues for his son. One is that if he doesn't ever see any signs of suffering, he'll grow up to become the greatest emperor that the world has ever known. But if he does see signs of suffering, he'll grow up to become the greatest spiritual master that the world has ever known. And as I tell my college students, his father wanted him to stay in the family business. And so he figures out a way to keep his son from seeing signs of suffering. And he does that by basically keeping his son imprisoned in a palace of pleasure. And that pleasure has a sedating effect so that he's just blissed out on all forms of sensory pleasure that make it impossible for him to imagine what suffering might be. So he grows into young adulthood without ever having left that palace. But finally, he manages to convince his father to let him outside of the palace. And his father still at that point keeps trying to block him from seeing signs of suffering. So with great effort, his father has his city cleared of any sites of suffering. And especially, he removes people who are sick, people who are old, and dead bodies from the streets of his city before he lets his son leave the palace. But with the intervention of celestial beings who know that the bodhisattva has to see those signs of suffering if he's going to become a Buddha, if he's going to finally attain the goal that he's been working to over all of the hundreds of lives when he was a bodhisattva. So he leaves the palace, and he sees these 4 omens or 4 signs of the sick body, the old body, and the dead body, and I'm leaving one out.
The ascetic that he sees.
Oh, and then he sees also a person who has made the choice of how the impermanence of their body will be, who is a renunciant, who is an ascetic, who makes the choice to change their body, to overcome suffering. So the bodies that we would now see as a monk or a nun. And so that story to me is just the great lengths we go to in that society from millennia before, and the stories of the Buddha's life that show how powerful suffering can be to our own transformation of understanding the reality of impermanence of our own embodied body and how we're going to move towards death. The impermanence of our bodies and the reality that we're not immortal, and that our relationships will change as our bodies experience suffering and impermanence. And so the king's men are ordered to make sure that none of these signs appear in the prince's pathway. And the piece that I really sort of zero in on now as I'm rereading that story with my illness is that if an ill person reappears on the pathway that the prince is going to be able to see. Oh, what is that? That's a body that's ill. What's illness? Oh, illness is when your body starts to lose its strength and its capacity to live into a future. That the king's men will come and take that ill body and put it in an alleyway, will hide it away. But in this story, the devas, these celestial beings who want to make sure the bodhisattva becomes a Buddha, go into these alleys, take up these ill bodies again, and put them back in the place where the bodhisattva will see them. And so as a person who's ill, I reread that story and I was like imagining myself on the sidewalks trying to catch sight of this prince who's never been seen outside of the palace before. And then I experienced like the king's men picking me up and hiding me away in an alleyway so that the prince won't see me. And then these celestial beings who need the prince to see what illness is coming in and picking me up and taking me back into the city and putting me on the sidewalk so that the prince will see me. And I'm like, hey, wait a second, I don't feel very good. Can you stop moving me from here to there? But there's this kind of existential tug of war. Like, she can't be seen. We can't see suffering. She must be seen. We have to see suffering. And it's not too hard to translate that into our own culture of what we turn our eyes away from and what we sort of anesthetize ourselves from seeing. And so as we live in our world, many of us turn our eyes away from the worst forms of suffering that we see because we just can't deal with it. We can't suffering. We can't see that degree of suffering. And how much we lose when we can't engage with it. We can't see that powerful form of impermanence is going to be in our pathway as well. And so engaging with this story again in this form made me think of my dissolving body or body that's degenerating from a way that's not all bad, but in a way that I come to see my body as powerful in a different kind of way.
Karen, in your book, you talk about living with the constant awareness of your own pending death and also the constant uncertainty of how that end stage will unfold and when it will be. There's a Buddhist meditation where we're trying to generate certainty that death is certain, but the time of death is uncertain. Can you tell us what you learned from your own experiences about the implications of living with the certainty of an end and the uncertainty when it will come?
Yes, I think living with a terminal disease like I am of my form of brain cancer has been a deep embodied experience of the impermanence of my body and the reality that I will die, which is a universal truth. But there is no denying that. There is no way of diluting that truth for me. My body is constantly changing. One day I have the physical strength to go for a walk. The next day I am stumbling and falling. And all of this is tied back to my disease and the treatment of my disease. So I I experience impermanence, and it's not a gentle or a sweet experience. It can be very brutal. So that's become something that's very known for me in an embodied kind of way. And it changes the way that I look at the Dharma teachings on impermanence. It's not just an analytical category. One of the foundational Buddhist teachings on impermanence, and we can look at it critically, where we say, what are examples of impermanence? You know, like a car is impermanent. You know, the parts of a car will get old and they'll break over time, and brake pads will have to be replaced and all of these kinds of things. But there's a way that when we use those kinds of examples, we're keeping it distant from ourselves. We're keeping it something outside of ourselves, something mechanical, something that can be fixed. But when you experience impermanence in your body, you can't distance yourself from it. It's happening inside of you, and you're feeling it. And then when you're feeling it physically, there's no way that it doesn't impact your emotions and your sense of self. I'm sorry, there was another part to your question.
The uncertainty, not knowing when.
Oh, right. That question of when will I die? When will my impermanence take a form that there's no moving forward with, has become the question for me. Not will I die, or what will I die from, although I know both of those things with a kind of clarity that most people can put off. The when will I die has become a question that I live with all the time. I think a lot of people, when they're asked when will they die, put it off like, I'll die when I'm very old. You know, maybe that accepts that they will die, but I'll die, when I'm 80 or 85. And for me, I know I'm living with the knowledge that I won't live with as much time as I'd like. And for me, this is all of the when will I die is measured by my children's life, and my life in my family. And so that when question has been the most difficult question that I live with. My daughter and son, who are not yet full adults, are burdened by that question. And so I want to ease that for them, but I can't. And so I've come to, for myself, to recognize that time has an impermanence to it, and that's a form of impermanence that most of us don't experience very clearly. To think about not only the impermanence of material things, the impermanence of emotions, but the impermanence of time. And on the one hand, that's really obvious. Like, time is always changing. The present moment is becoming the future moment. The past is becoming farther and farther away. But to live with the uncertainty of time has become something that I find emotionally most difficult. And I've found sort of an amazement with the COVID pandemic that most people still can't accept that the uncertainty of their relationship to time is an ever-present reality of impermanence that we live with.
Were there stories on impermanence that were particularly useful to you?
Yeah, the story of Sumedha is one of my favorite Buddhist stories, and it has been for a long time. But rereading it since my diagnosis of grade 4 cancer, I've come to see it and have an experience of it in a really different way. So this is a story that I wrote on in my dissertation, so I lived very closely with it for a long period of time. But now I'm living with that story with a new question. And that question is, how can I live with knowing I'm dying well? How can I live well? And how can Buddhist stories help me live well? So it's a new relationship with the story of Sumedha. So the story of Sumedha is about a young man who decides to renounce the world after his parents die. He gives away all the family wealth. He gives up every opportunity or avenue for life other than becoming an ascetic. And he's living in a cave in the mountains with nothing. When he hears that a Buddha is coming to the town below his cave, and from his powers of flight, he flies down and joins the villagers along the route that the Buddha Dipankara will come past. And there's one piece of the pathway that he that hasn't been cleared and cleaned, made perfect for this Buddha, and so he lies down in the mud so that the Buddha can have a completely clean pathway. And as the Buddha approaches, he stops right at the head of Sumedha, so that Sumedha is now in a position of devotion. He is prostrating himself at the feet of the Buddha. And the Buddha says to his monks who are with him and all the villagers that have gathered to see this Buddha, a Buddha that exists in far, far time before our Buddha, Shakyamuni. And the Buddha Dipankara makes a prediction of Sumedha's future, and he sees the future, the Buddha, this Buddha Dipankara, and he tells Sumedha that in this far, far distant future, a future that is so far in the future that you can't count it, that Sumedha will become the Buddha Shakyamuni. And that future is described to him in great detail, where he'll be born, what the name of his mother and father will be, what his lifetime as a Buddha will be. And so it's like a blueprint of everything. And when I got diagnosed with my grade 4 incurable brain cancer, I thought back to that story and I thought, I want to know, like with that kind of certainty, what my future looks like. Because the uncertainty of how long will I live and what will how will my body disintegrate? When and in what ways will I become disabled is really what I wanted to know. I knew I was going to die from this form of cancer because there is no cure for it, but I didn't know when that would happen. And it wasn't only my death, but the impermanence of my body turning to its lack of ability to do things that I was very concerned about. But over time, I realized as I was working with this story, again, with very different questions, that the point of the story was not to tell the certainty of time for the people who were surrounding Sumedha, but it was for the Bodhisattva Sumedha it wasn't for the other people around. And that having a prediction, which wasn't possible for me anyways, because I'm not a bodhisattva, that predictions of the future are for the bodhisattva. It's not for the people around them. That the point of the impermanence of time is what I needed to open myself up to, and that time is impermanent, and this was an experience that I could begin to learn from the impermanence of time is another way I could go deeper into my experience of impermanence. I'd never thought too deeply about what the impermanence of time is and the possibilities of transforming myself by putting myself into the impermanence of time and growing and learning from that.
Karen, in one sense, there's this idea that we die alone. But it's clear in your book that your preparation for that experience takes place in relationship. You're doing this preparation as a wife, as a friend, and especially as a mother. How does being in relationship affect your experience of this stage?
I think the family relationships that I have as a lay Buddhist woman are very important. I see the ways in which I can turn to others in my community to ask them to be present for my children as a source of love for them after my death has been one way I've done that. And that was really a very powerful struggle for me when my children were younger and I was first diagnosed. As they get closer and closer to adulthood, that feels, it has less intensity. But in different ways, the Dharma has taught me that while I was one source of love and compassion for my children, I was not the only source, and that source of love and care, like all things, was changing all the time and would be true for my children. And so that intensity of clinging on to this idea that I had to be here to give them a life of having a source of love and care, that it didn't need to come from me, and that there were many, many sources for that. And that just eased my fear, and it eased my sense of holding on to my son and daughter so tightly that needed to change anyways, because as they were growing older, our relationship was going through its own cycle of impermanence, and I needed to let go and let them change in the ways that their life was needing to change. And so in that way, I think everyone, regardless of when they're going to die, but in their relationships, needs to feel the impermanence of time and the ways in which our relationships of most intense care and most intense love, we need to allow them to change with time. And for me, like, that's been the intense holding on to the experience I had as a little girl. I had to let that go. I had to really allow my adult self as a woman who is very courageous and strong, could take care of herself and could take care of herself through cancer and cancer treatment in some ways. In other ways, I had to, once I put that fear down, I could accept help from other people. And as a professional woman and mother who had found it difficult to ask for help, because a lot of our professional lives say, well, if you're going to take this on, you got to be able to do all of it. So I had a hard time asking for help, that I really needed to ask for help. And that sometimes people would give it to me and sometimes they wouldn't. And the disappointment of not being given help when I asked for it, I could survive that. I was going to be okay. And but I needed to learn how to ask for and accept help from others, from my community.
You also talk about how isolating your physical condition can be and how hard it can be for people to see you and to know how to relate to you. Can you offer any reflections for people who have loved ones who are experiencing serious illness or terminal illness?
I think seeing them fully is what feels like I often don't have, and would be so healing to really be seen for this new form of who I am. And sometimes I say that that's what I want, but then it's hard for me to be seen that way. You know, my family, from their love and caretaking of me, will say, don't go down that staircase, it's too dangerous. And it's difficult to not be able to do things that would have been the most everyday things that I had done. So there's some negotiating that has to happen, both for the ill person and the caretaker. And I think for the person who's ill, if they can be as accepting that those changes are being made with love and care, and accept them in that way, not with anger. And for the caretaker to realize that the loss of those kind of small everyday actions has a big impact on a person's sense of self and dignity. And so preserving a dignity of the person whose health is declining is, I think, very, very important.
And Karen, as someone living this experience specifically as a mother, what resources did you find as you prepared others for your eventual passing at the same time as you're preparing yourself?
I think it's been a little bit peculiar for me because a tumor was found accidentally on an MRI that was looking for multiple sclerosis when my eldest child was just 1 year old. So a brain tumor was found accidentally on that scan. And so I've known that I had a brain tumor for the entire time that my children have been alive. I didn't know the cancer diagnosis and the evolving state of the cancer the entire time I've been a mother, but I've known that possibility. And so that's a little bit different. As they've grown, I've changed the way that I prepared them and I've spoken with them. When they reached an age that I felt like I could talk to them about it, I made the decision with their father that I wanted to be honest when they asked any question, to be truthful, because I wanted them to have a steady sense of where the ground was and that they could trust that, so they weren't sort of like, is there more that I don't know? Are they trying to protect me from it? But just like, this is what's going on. But also recognizing that different members of your family may be able to hold that reality or that information differently, and that there might need to be different ways of sharing information at different tempos or at different points with different members of the family, and so that it really has to be very specific to the person. I've also tried to offer reassurances without lying. You know, like a reassurance for me is I will do anything I can, like take any treatment that I can to keep me alive, so that you grow up with a mother. And that's a truth. Like, if I have to have several more surgeries to keep myself alive while they're still at home and depending on me, then I'll do it. And so they have that reassurance from me, but there's very little else I can reassure them with. We talk openly about it, but sometimes they don't want to talk, and so I don't. I've, since I've known of this impermanence in my body since they've been babies, I've reached out, and there are a few women who I've purposely invited into our family, into their lives, who, if my children and those people want to, after I'm dead, have a sort of mothering relationship, but that, that will be up to them. But I've built the foundation that that's something that would make me happy, something that I want for them. And those people have been a part of their life in those ways. And so there's no sense of, I don't want to be replaced. I want them to take the love that I've given to them and share that love with other people, and realize they have people they can go to for help, that I would have been the person that they went to. I've tried to show them that there are these other people who will be those sources of love and help, and that we've all been okay with that. We've all wanted that, and I hope that that will make it easier for them in the future. And I've really tried to show them that suffering and grief is just one part of life, that there'll always be beauty and happiness around them, and that as my health has gotten harder and harder, I've tried to show them that I experienced that, so to be a role model in that, and that there's so many small things that can make us feel joy. And so they joke around about me about how excited I get when I see birds from our windows, or if there's a particularly beautiful sunset or group of clouds, that I'm always like, hey, come and look at this, look at these clouds, aren't they amazing? Or there's a new hummingbird that came by the feeder today. And those are little kinds of things. From the time they were young, I've tried to help them really be attuned to all the sources of beauty that are in the world, and that no matter how sad they are when I die, that life is just not only suffering, that there's always joy.